methodologies to address sort of specific issues in materials and protein science. And I've just popped up here 4 specific topics that we have been working on. So our flagship project or program is on organic materials for energy and electronics. We're also working on, let's say, oxide-water interfaces for photoelectric catalysis. We're also working on charge transport in biology, especially we're looking at proteins, redox proteins that are interesting for bioelectronics. And a few years ago, we also worked quite a lot on ligand binding to metalloenzymes. And I have just 3 slides for each of these topics. Okay, so the first one is excitonic solar cells. So this is the picture that I stole from Clark and Durant from Nice Review. So we all what it's about. It's about excitation of electrons by sunlight. You have excitations. You have 2 materials. The exciton migrates here to the interface and dissociates into mobile charge carriers. And if they manage to sort of dissociate, then they produce electricity. And so the big problem, so the reason, why they are not sort of used yet is because the efficiency is still pretty small, and the biggest problem is charge recombination. So these charges just cannot fully separate, and after a while they get together and recombine, and so these are huge efficiency losses. And there are lots of things that are going on in such an excitonic solar cell. And the process that we have focused so far is entirely charge transport. So in this project that we have been busy with now for the last 4 or 5 years, so we have been trying to understand how actually these charge carriers, how they look like and how they move in these materials. And so we have developed methodology, a mixed quantum classical non-adiabatic MV methodology that allows us to propagate these charge carriers in time. And so this is the time-dependent Schrödinger equation that we solve with, and we can do that very efficiently because we're using rather cheap electronic Hamiltonians that are parameterized to DFT calculation. So we are solving this equation coupled to nuclear motion, and here it's just a movie that I show here. So this is the whole carrier wave function basically propagated in time in a pentacene crystal. And what you see is that it's a highly dynamical object, and so you need very large system sizes to actually converge the diffusion of these polarons. So we can do this. We can do calculations on more than 1,000 molecules, and we can calculate diffusion coefficients and charge mobilities. So to the right, I plot the computed mobility with the experimental mobility for a large number of these materials, and the agreement is usually pretty good. So it's so that sort of made us very happy. We also published quite a on the order of 2 papers a year, so on this methodology. So that's so the outlook here is that now we would like to extend this and go from charge carrier transport to exciton transport in molecular materials. Now we are more or less have done this now, and the next step is to look at real interfaces in such cells. That means an interface between N-type and P-type material. Especially what we're interested in, what basically drives electron hole separation versus recombination. And with this methodology that we have developed, I think it's quite unique. So we can look at the effect of quantum delocalization of the carriers, electronic coupling, the Coulomb barrier, thermal fluctuations, also electric field effects. And what we also would like to know is sort of what drives the dissociation to free charge carriers. And so previously, people have done that for the last 30 or 40 years, but with relatively simplistic models. But now, since we are now basically really starting from the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, still within these simplified electronic Hamiltonian. I think it's a much more general methodology that allows us to look at these things. Now, in terms of collaborations, I think since we're using kind of tight binding electronic structure Hamiltonians, what we always welcome is basically people who could actually calculate excitation energies in molecular crystals with beyond DFT methods, so multi-body perturbation or GW, these kind of things, that allows us to further benchmark our electronic Hamiltonians. Then also, I mean, if people do this cheap and accurate electronic polarizable force field, so that's also something very important if you study charge separation. We still don't have nuclear quantum effects because it's a mixed quantum classical method. So this is maybe not so much of a problem at room temperature, but at lower temperatures it's a problem. And we also have some efforts ongoing to go beyond that surface hopping non-adiabatic methodology. So how am I doing this time? Is it almost over?
You have about 3 minutes left, I think.
3 minutes left. Okay, so the second one is transition metal oxide liquid water interfaces. So that's obviously has a lot of interesting applications. So that's a project with PNNL. So this is very different from the previous one. Here we use ab initio molecular dynamic simulations to calculate, let's say, lots of things that are important, like for instance, surface acidity constants. So what's the pK value of OH groups at these terminating surfaces? So that's something people really are interested in. Or we are looking at excess polaronic excess charge carriers in oxide materials. So here we just got a paper published here where we look at holes and electrons and how they localize. So here, I think in future, we would like to be able to predict electron transfer rates between solvated molecules interacting with the semiconductor electrode. And also would like to go at electrified interfaces and calculate, in the end, ab initio current voltage curves. So this is something that the electrochemists care about. In terms of collaborations, I think we have lots of experience here for the simulation of oxide liquid interfaces, calculation of acidity constants, rate constants, so we can calculate hopping or electron hopping rate constants from special DFT methods that we could use in combination with master equation or kinetic Monte Carlo approaches. And yeah, so this is our expertise in this area. Now, bioelectronics, so this is a very new field. So people nowadays can actually put proteins between gold electrodes. So this is an extension to molecular electronics. So you do this with proteins, and our collaborators at Weizmann, they could measure IV curves for this. And this one protein that they did had tunneling currents that were, in fact, 3 orders of magnitude larger than our proteins, and they were trying to understand that. And so it seems if you fit that, it's not a hopping, so it's a coherent tunneling process over 3 nanometers, which is very unusual. We're trying to understand that. So we have in the CP2K code implemented a methodology that allows us to calculate basically at least Landauer currents for these kind of big systems. And that requires huge Hamiltonians because everything is done with DFT, 20,000 electrons, and we have to calculate this Concham Hamiltonian to get all the parameters that you need for a Landauer current and for a transmission function. And these are the results, are pretty good, looks pretty good. Maybe some cancellation of errors going on there, so we're pretty happy. The problem there is that currently we are not doing the full transmission function, but we use a diagonal approximation to it. So here it's a bit tricky. So these things have been also implemented in Transistor, but they cannot do as large systems as we can do. So here we are trying to implement a decimation algorithm to deal with the complex self-energy operator, the inversion of it. And here we are currently, running into problems. Now, if anyone has experience with that, I'm most welcome and would be happy to talk to him or her. And another thing is that we can go up to tetraheme proteins, but the experimentalists, of course, want to study much bigger systems. So there's then the question, we can do 50,000 times 50,000 Concham Hamiltonians, but we actually would need to go probably to millions or something like this. So I'm not quite sure how we can get there in the end. And the third one is on ligand transport in proteins. So actually, this was the question, how ligands actually go to the active side of proteins. And now that's quite topical with the coronavirus, of course. And so we have developed a methodology from trajectories to Markov state models to diffusion rates that allow us to basically know per second how many ligands actually go into that binding site. And okay, so this is just an animation. And this was also nice comparison work with an experimentalist where we looked at a given protein for different mutants. We could sort of reproduce the diffusion rate pretty well. And so our expertise here is diffusion of molecules generally in heterogeneous networks. So it doesn't have to be a protein, it can also be, let's say, a material or some other network. So we have expertise with enhanced sampling methods, especially for slow transitions there, and generally with Markov state modeling using MD data. And that's it. I hope it was not too long. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jochen. Excuse me. So you've got a couple of questions. Sally would like to know, how do the electronically polarizable force fields that you want differ from commonly available force fields?
Can you say again, please?
If you pull up your chat box as well, and then you'll be able to see. Yeah. And I'll unmute you, Sally.
Sorry. Can do that. Oh, I think it's just, I'm still.
Sally, you're unmuted, so if you wanted to ask outright your question.
Yes, what I wanted to know was whether you said you wanted cheap and accurate, but is there something special apart from that which everybody wants, which is a contradiction in terms? Is there anything special that you want from your force fields, that from the nature of the problem that you're dealing with? That's different from most requirements for intermolecular force fields.
So what is special? I mean, what we need to accurately have to calculate are these charge transfer energies, so we know very well that they are extremely sensitive on the polarization of at least the nearest neighbor and the second nearest neighbor. So this needs to be properly accounted for. Now, in terms of computational feasibility, we have to be very efficient. So the problem is that each MD time step, and you have a time step of, let's say, 100 attoseconds or something like this. So you have 10,000 MD steps. So this needs to be calculated in a second or something like this. No, on one. So it must be. So that's the problem. So many of the polarizable force fields, they work with induced dipoles, and then you have to iterate self-consistently. So these things are probably too expensive.
The first answer was the main one. It is the problem that you have got to see how the charge modeling how the charge distribution of your molecules is being affected by the other molecules, position of the other molecules at present. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so we have already looked at polarizable force, and we actually looked at this, and it's important. Is I think the first two nearest neighbors. I think this is important too. So maybe one can come up with some sort of localization scheme where one doesn't have to include the induced dipole interacting with all the other induced dipoles, but basically treat this on a sort of in a sort of localized fashion.
But so, you're talking about nearest neighbor molecules.
Yeah. So the charge, if a charge sits on one molecule, then it polarizes the nearest neighbors and probably also the second nearest neighbors. So this is quite a large
molecules. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is quite a large contribution. That needs to be so we are currently looking at methods to deal with that efficiently. But I mean, if anyone else has expertise on this, it would be great to have a chat, I think.
Okay, if we move on to the next question. So Alex Schluger would like to know, how do you model large radius polarons?
So this is because I mean, I don't have any slides on that. I didn't show any slides on this. So in the end, what we do in these simulations, showed the movie, is that we reconstruct basically the electronic states that's formed by the homo orbitals of the molecules. So this is what you need to do in order to simulate a whole transport. And so this is what we have done now in unpublished work, and this we do with our tight binding Hamiltonian. And each tight binding Hamiltonian, the basis function is essentially a homo of one orbital. And the whole carrier wave function is then expanded as a linear combination of the homos of the orbitals. And the homos of the orbitals, of course, they can also readjust to the nuclear dynamics. And then each let's say, homo on each molecule has then an expansion coefficient. And what you saw in the movie is essentially the amplitude of the wave function on a given molecule is proportional to that expansion coefficient.
So does it mean that relaxation is not important, or is not included?
No, it is all included. So reorganization energy is included. If the whole wants to localize, it can localize, and this is what we have shown. If it wants to form a band, it can form a band. The problem is if it forms a band, and since we have a finite cluster, then basically we cannot converge the wave function. But the good thing in that methodology, it doesn't assume it's a small polaron. It doesn't assume it's a band. It can be anything. It's completely determined by how the coupling compares to the trapping energy and the thermal fluctuation of the coupling. So these are the major ingredients that determine whether you have a small polaron sitting only on one molecule, or whether you have a medium polaron that delocalizes over a few molecules, or you have a large polaron that can actually delocalize over nanometers, things like that. So in that example that I showed is pentacene. So we get a delocalization over 20 molecules, and that's very good in agreement with ESR, with spin resonance data. So they also estimate it's around 20.
So can I just ask another thing? So do you actually deal with singlet excitons in that model, or you deal with triplet excitons?
So I haven't shown anything about excitons yet. We have just now done exciton transport as well, and in this case we did anthracene crystal, and in this case was a very nice sort of singlet exciton, and it's known from experiment that you don't have singlet triplet transition for that. But I mean, we could also do triplet in the end. So. And then you have to extend the state space of your Hamiltonian.